Let's go ahead and get started. Good evening and welcome to Copperfield's Books virtual event with Michael Moss. My name is Jamie Madsen and I'm the Marketing and Events Coordinator here at Copperfield's Books, and I'll also be your host for the evening. Copperfield's Books has been committed to literature, education, and creating community together since our founding in 1981. So just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. I will be using the chat box to provide links to see upcoming Copperfields events, details for purchasing tonight's title, as well as a 10% discount code for use on our website. And I will also include my contact details for follow-up information. Additionally, the Q&A box will be your go-to tonight with any questions or comments. The format will feature between 30 to 40 minutes of speaking and will be followed by a live Q&A. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see an icon that says Q&A. Please submit your questions here rather than replying to me in the chat box. So without further ado, I'm really excited to introduce tonight's author, though he needs a little introduction, Mr. Michael Moss. Michael Moss is the author of the #1 New York Times bestseller, Salt, Sugar, Fat: How the Food Giants Hooked Us, a Pulitzer Prize winning investigative reporter formerly with the New York Times, a keynote speaker, and an occasional guest on shows like CBS This Morning, The Dr. Oz Show, CNN's The Lead, All Things Considered, and The Daily Show. He is with us this evening to discuss his latest title, Hooked: Food, Free Will, and How the Food Giants Exploit Our Addictions. So with that, I'm really excited to hand it over to you, Michael. Why don't you take it away?
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for your work. You're an independent bookstore near and dear to my heart, and I thank the people coming to listen today, and especially for your questions. I'm going to talk a little bit, and then I really look forward to having an exchange and hearing your thoughts and ideas and questions and responding to what especially you'd like to talk about. And it's especially great zooming into Northern California because I was born in Eureka, raised in the Central Valley, but then also in San Francisco proper, which I still consider home for me, even though I've been in Brooklyn for quite a while now. My journey into like the underbelly of the food industry actually began in 2008 when I was in Algeria interviewing Islamic militants, and a couple of FBI agents showed up at the New York Times headquarters in New York looking for me. I'd been traveling to Iraq, tormenting the Pentagon for failing to equip American soldiers with army, and then throughout the Middle East, looking at the war on terrorism. When I got in some trouble, and according to the FBI, I had managed to land myself on an Al-Qaeda hit list. And I mention that only because when my editors called me home that very night, I went from one war to another. Back at the Times, we were sitting around thinking of a new subject to write about that would keep me in the United States for a while. And my editor said to me, "Hey, Michael, what do you think about peanuts?" And I thought it was kind of a joke because I was pitching her a new story about US arms sales. She goes, "No, hear me out. There is a factory in southern Georgia on the Alabama border that is spewing out peanuts contaminated by salmonella. People are getting sick, some people are dying in many states around the country." And so I went down and took a look, and this was this incredibly tragic window on this $1 trillion industry called the processed food industry that in this case had lost control over its food chain because weeks and weeks were going by after the factory was identified as the source of this outbreak, and the companies were still trying to figure out which of their dozens and dozens of products were using these particular peanuts. And I next wrote about contamination of hamburger with E. coli. And in that case, it was a story about a processed food industry, a part of the industry that was almost kind of intentionally not taking steps to make food safer for us because there were some steps to do. And I was in the course of reporting on food safety some more when I had dinner with one of my best sources who tested meat for the meat industry. And he said to me, you know, Michael, as tragic as these incidents of contamination are, you really should look at the things that my industry, he meant the meat industry, is intentionally adding to its products over which it has total control. He was concerned about the huge amounts of salt that go into processed food. I started looking at salt and then fat and then sugar as this unholy trinity, if you will, in which the food industry relies to make its products, you know, inexpensive and convenient and yummy. And I was incredibly lucky to come across a trove of inside documents that allowed me to sit at the table of the largest food companies as they're formulating and engineering and marketing their products. And it was those documents that enabled me to identify key insiders who talked to me, opened up, and revealed even more secrets about the industry. And I have to say, the overwhelming sense you get from that, and this is what became the first book, Salt, Sugar, Fat, is that this is an industry that was driving to get us to not just like its products, but to want more and more of them. And the book came out to lots of attention. You know, it helped ignite, you know, a huge public conversation about our relationship with convenience foods, processed foods. And I tried to end the book on a hopeful note, being a journalist, thinking that knowledge is empowering, and knowing all the tricks that the food companies use to get us to choose their products when we walk into a grocery store or convenience fast restaurants would help us be able to make better decisions about what to eat and how much to eat. But the very first question, in fact, I think this came from a British TV journalist, was, but Michael, I mean, isn't this stuff you're writing about addictive like drugs? And if so, how can you say we have any say in the matter? And, you know, that was like 5 or 6 years ago. And my first reaction was, what, Twinkies, like heroin? I mean, that sounds totally nutso. But then something else happened, which is not long after Salt, Sugar, Fat came out. I got an invitation from none other than Nestle, the largest food company of all, who wanted me to come in and talk to their research and development officials, tell them all the things that I thought they were doing wrong because they were intending to do right. And in fact, they were leading the industry in trying to sort of cut back on their use of salt, sugar, fat. And in some ways were really impressive with that. Although, when I said to them, okay, fine, they own the Hot Pockets brand, by the way, I said, fine, but what are you doing to, you know, to respond to what all nutritionists tell us, which is we should be eating more vegetables and fruits? Are you stuffing those Hot Pockets with Brussels sprouts and broccoli raw? I mean, I, you know, get this blank look from them because, again, the industry is so dependent on their products being inexpensive, cheap, and wowing the brain that that's a very difficult step for them. But my point is that, you know, in the last couple of years, if anything, even though the companies were reformulating to make their products perhaps less harmful, our trouble with food, if anything, has even grown worse. Obesity for adults now is past 42%. I've lost track of the millions and millions of people with type 2 diabetes. There are several million people with gout, believe it or not. And eating disorders, binge eating, is kind of only one end of the spectrum of our trouble with food. I mean, I think that so many of us are feeling like either we're losing control of our eating habits or we're having to expend so much energy staying in control of our eating habits, or we just have this feeling that we've lost kind of the love and the ritual of eating home-cooked meals with family, having fallen so hard with for processed food. And so I thought, yeah, this would be a really good thing to do as a journalist, was take a look at this question. Can we look at these products as being addictive like drugs? And what lessons might we be able to take out of out of that process. And eventually, I have to say, I came full circle on the question of whether we should be viewing these ultra processed foods um, as addictive. I'm now convinced, having spoken to researchers who used to study drug addiction and now study food, um, chemists working for the processed food industry, more of their internal documents, people who are struggling with severe loss of control with things like sugar and other aspects of processed food, that in many ways these products can be more problematic, more causing us a loss of control, more addictive, if you will, than even the harshest drugs. And one of the first things I had to do in my mind, because there was pushback from the industry on a couple of grounds. One was, how can you call Oreos addictive if only some people lose control and not everybody? And so I looked at drugs, and it turns out that, you may know this, but that there are people who can smoke casually, a cigarette a day, and skip a day, and not feel any overwhelming urge to dip into the pack for more. There are people who can drink casually and not get overwhelmed by it. There are some people who can use heroin casually, take it or leave it. And so that same situation obviously applies to food as well. And the other pushback I got from the industry was that, how can you say our products are addictive like drugs if they lack the harsh chemicals that drugs have, right? Where's the addictive chemical you can't even pronounce in food? It's not there. There's sugar and there's salt and there's fat and what have you. But no chemical. And that's when I spent time with biologists who've been studying and who sort of pioneered our understanding of addiction and how addiction happens in the brain with using our own body's natural chemicals that are designed to attract us and get us to do things. Dopamine is one of the most famous ones that you've heard about. It affects our liking and wanting of products, but there's a whole slew of other hormones that we manufacture in our body that are triggered by outside substances. And so even things like food will cause a triggering and a rush of these hormones in the brain, like drugs and alcohol and cigarettes can as too. The other important step I sort of took in the beginning of the book was also kind of looked at the definition of addiction. And it was a real eye-opening moment for me when I discovered and sort of tracked the history of tobacco denying addiction, because for decades and decades the companies vehemently, maintained that smoking was not addictive. And in the year 2000, Philip Morris, the largest company, broke with them and said, you know what? You were right. Smoking is addictive. We're going to take steps to deal with that. And that same year, this was 2000, the then CEO of the company was asked in legal proceedings, well, what's your definition of addiction? And he said, my definition of addiction is a repetitive behavior that some people find difficult to quit. And I was really struck by that, because at the time, as I reported in Salt, Sugar, Fat, Philip Morris wasn't just the largest cigarette manufacturer in North America. It was the single largest manufacturer of processed food through its acquisition of the old company General Foods, Kraft, and then Nabisco. It was making Oreo cookies. And I later caught up with the general counsel for Philip Morris, the top lawyer. And we were chatting about Philip Morris's turn on addiction. And I just kind of happened to ask him about, if he smoked cigarettes and kind of what he ate. His name was Steve Parrish. And he said to me, Michael, I was one of those casual smokers. I could smoke 1-2 cigarettes a day, and I only did so during business meetings. I'd put the pack away. I never smoked at home, rarely outside of the office. But I couldn't go near a bag of Oreo cookies for fear of losing control and eating half of the bag. And, another light went on in my head saying, wow, these are insiders of these companies making these products, being scared of them, and recognizing the power that these products can kind of have over us. And yet, still, I was nervous about kind of the addiction question too, and got some pushback even from some of the scientists I was speaking to, including a fabulous researcher now at Yale named Dana Small. Dana was the very first person who figured out how to look at the brain while we ate, because normally always when you slide into an fMRI brain scanner, you can't move or you'll blur the images. But Dana, being a self-professed chocoholic, realized she could put a square of chocolate on people's tongue, slide them in, and ask them to just sit there calmly and let the chocolate melt over their tongues while she's watching the brain light up in the reward center. Well, it was Dana later who said to me, you know, Michael, it's not so much that we're addicted to food, it's that we by nature are drawn to food, to eat, and even to overeat. Because for most of our existence, putting on body fat was a really good thing, and I'll get to that. But then she said, the problem is that the companies changed the nature of our food. And this has happened so fast in the last 50 years that from an evolutionary standpoint, from a genetic standpoint, we haven't had near the amount of time that we need to respond to these companies. And two, what they're doing, and then the other reason, or the other point that sort of Hooked makes, is that it's not just what you read on the label of these products that's problematic. In fact, that's not even the half of it. These companies are exploiting our basic instincts that draw us toward food and manipulating their products to, to expand upon those instincts. And so let me walk through a few of those with us. We by nature are drawn to food that's cheap, meaning involves the least amount of energy expenditure on our part. When we were in hunter-gatherer societies, it just made much more sense, instead of running down an impala for dinner, to grab an aardvark that was sitting there and have that. And so the food companies have at their behest chemical laboratories that mix and match and formulate chemicals. They're the companies that come up with things like pumpkin pie spice using as many 80 chemical ingredients in them. But their chief mission for the food companies is to find ways to reformulate their products to bring down the cost, even if it's 10 cents on a box of toaster pastries. They know that we'll get excited by that. We get excited by variety. And going back to our forebears, it makes sense, because as we spread around the world, living in places, we had to adjust to eating different food, even some of us whale blubber. And so variety became a trait and a characteristic of our relationship to food. And so what do the food companies do? Walk into the cereal aisle, you will find in larger supermarkets 200 versions of sugary starch, knowing that we'll get excited about it, and also knowing the thing called the smorgasbord effect, where you're walking down the buffet, putting different items on your plate. You're already full even before you start eating, but there's a new thing right to the right, and what do? You put it on your plate, of course, because variety is a really key thing. And then maybe the third thing, and most important, that they did is that we love calories as much as we do salt, sugar, fat. And in fact, we have sensors in our gut, possibly also in the mouth, that tell us how many calories we're taking in when we eat and drink. And again, the brain responds to that by saying, love calories, let's eat more. So what did the food industry do? They began making products that were densely packed with calories, so that we eat so much, so fast, and get so many calories before the front part of our brain, which scientists like to call the stop part of the brain. It's where willpower lies. It's our executive function. It's where the brain says, Michael, I think you've had enough of that snack. Let's like do something else now. Before it can actually step up and say that, the go part of the brain is running for more calories. And the goal of eating calories was to put on more body fat. It turns out that humans, well, it turns out I've learned from evolutionary biologists that humans, we were the fattest mammals on the planet because body fat allowed our brains to grow. It allowed us to get through hard times. It allowed us to have more babies. Fat was our best friend. But what's happened now totally blew me away because now scientists are realizing that body fat is an organ. It thinks, it communicates with the rest of the body. And as we put on more body fat, its sole mission in life is to prevent us from going on the attack and losing that body fat. So when you try to go on a diet to lose weight, your body fat is sending signals to the brain saying, I'm hungry, eat more. And also signals to your metabolism saying, slow down, don't burn so many calories just sitting there, protect me. And one of the most fascinating things I learned going to Oregon, where a researcher's been looking at our relationship to food and thinking about ways we can change our value, he's the first person to track people over time as they gained weight. And he noticed, looking at their brain response to food, that as we gain weight, we become more sensitive to, vulnerable to what psychologists call cues, what the food industry calls advertising. Our brains light up and get more excited just by looking at food and pictures of food, not to mention eating it as we gain as we gain weight. And there are other ways that that food is kind of more problematic than drugs in this sense. It's inexpensive, as I mentioned. It's convenience. I mean, we became really enamored by, sort of by necessity, going back 40 and 50 years ago when more and more women began working outside of the house. So suddenly you had two people coming home at 7 o'clock going, how are we going to get dinner on the table? That's when the food industry invented the term convenience food and basically raised its hand and said, don't worry, I'll take care of dinner for you. Convenience is great, but there's been this hidden price in convenience foods. And again, because in order to deliver convenience, the food industry has become, has to use gobs of salt, sugar, fat, but also these other methods of getting us to love their products and want more and more. And I think maybe one of the most intriguing ways that food is more problematic than drugs is speed. So drug researchers realize that the faster a drug can get into your system and hit the brain, the more apt the brain is to respond and act impulsively, compulsively to that signal. Those same researchers have been looking at food and realize that there's actually nothing faster than the way food hits the brain, because it has a little trick. And you have to remember that our neurological system was designed to get us to love food. So what happens when you put food in your mouth? The taste buds pick it up, the sensation, and send a signal almost instantly to the brain. So they did this little experiment, sat people down and said, we want to measure how long it takes for you to taste sweetness. So they put a little sugar on people's tongue and asked them to press a button when they tasted sweet. Sugar on the tongue, signal to the brain signal to the finger, less than 1 second. It took 0.8 of a second for that sweetness to hit the brain. By comparison, cigarette smoke can take as long as 10 seconds to sort of fully hit the brain, and drugs are kind of in between there. And that really kind of opened my eyes to this expression, fast food or fast groceries, because everything about the processed food industry, making ultra processed food products, is about speed. whether it's in the factory making processed cheese, where they came up with this slogan, milk in one day, cheese out the next, um, or this whole phenomenon of snacking. You know, snack food, incredibly fast. We eat with one hand, not thinking about it, not activating the stop part of the brain that can help us make good decisions. The average person in America now is getting some 560 calories from snack foods. Uh, 1/4, basically, of the calories are snacking's become, the fourth American meal. Um, and so, how did the industry deal with this when people sort of started catching on that, wait a minute, there are like all kinds of ways that we're losing out to these products and losing control based on their going after our basic instincts. Well, um, for one thing, they went into the courts and into the state legislatures to prevent people from suing them for making them fat. They went into science and took control of some really interesting experiments that I wrote about to make sure those experiments either benefited them or didn't happen at all. Here was a real shocker for me. When we decided, kind of en masse, to start trying to cope with the weight gain that was going on in this country by dieting, none other than the largest processed food companies quietly bought up our favorite dieting methods. And I'm talking Weight Watchers, Atkins, Slim Fast, and not only that, but they started going into the supermarket, creating new formulas of their basic products and calling those diet foods, when really there wasn't all that much difference between the diet foods and the regular foods. And more recently, in kind of responding to our growing concern about what we put in our bodies, the companies have been saying, okay, they've kind of gone through the denial phase, they've kind of gone through the delay phase. They're now kind of saying, okay, we yield, we capitulate, but are they really? And some of the things you're seeing now, I think, qualify as what I like to call health washing. And so, in order to help us deal with our losing control over their products, they're doing things like adding protein to sugary cereal, because there's some sense that protein can be satiating and control our hunger and cravings. But in sugary cereal, probably not. They're adding fiber to products because we have the sense that fiber in fruits and vegetables, yeah, but adding it to these processed food products to slow us down, make us feel fuller, not happening. And then finally, they're looking at, they're actually starting to look at our DNA to see if there's any possibility that we could, we could tweak our DNA for kind of the ultimate outcome in their view, which is to be able to eat as much as we possibly want without gaining weight or otherwise getting ill. And so that's kind of the broad sweep of Hooked. Again, looking specifically at the industry's sort of ability to use us, if you will, as almost unwitting conspirators in their effort to, get us dependent, get us hooked on their products, and keep us hooked. And so, I'm getting asked, of course, like, what can we do about this? And look, as a journalist, I still believe that knowledge is power, and knowing what the companies are up to, walking into the grocery store or a restaurant, does help us make decisions. But one of the other lessons from looking at the world of drug addiction and alcoholism and cigarettes is that when cravings come on, if you're in the throes of a real craving, knowledge doesn't always save you. I mean, free will can go out the door really, really fast. So if you're somebody who, on lower or down on the spectrum of addiction, just, has a craving for cookies at 3 p.m. in the afternoon, and it's irresistible. You pretty much need to be executing your defense plan, whether it's standing up and stretching or calling a friend or eating something else that's better for you, like a handful of nuts. You pretty much need to be doing that by, at 2:55, before that 3 o'clock craving comes on, lights up the go part of your brain, puts the stop part of your brain to sleep. So, I mean, I think we need to. One of the lessons from the world of drugs and alcohol and cigarettes is we need to do more planning, more thinking ahead. And then the other thing I'm really liking these days is kind of this idea that a lot of these things that the food industry use, I would argue, against us, even salt, sugar, fat, they didn't invent. They took those from us. There's nothing wrong with salt, sugar, fat in the hands of a home cook who doesn't have all the reasons to use gobs of that the food industry does for preservation, so it can sit on the shelf for months and etc. Um, and likewise, convenience and inexpensive. Nothing wrong with those. And I think there's some really cool ways that we can turn the tables on the industry to kind of regain control of our eating habits by taking back things that they took from us. And I'll give you an example in our house. In order to help us move away from sugary soda, and mind you, I have a 16-year-old in the house now, we've switched to plain soda, seltzer. And what's really cool about that is because before there was Coca-Cola and Pepsi adding sugar to bubbly water, there was plain bubbly water, right? There's a town in Germany named Seltzer. There were connoisseurs of seltzer back there because one of the neat things about bubbles, and scientists don't quite understand this yet because it's a little weird because they have a bite when you drink seltzer, but they excite the brain almost as much as sugar, and that's just enough to help my 16-year-old say, okay, I'm good with this. I don't need the sugary soda. But there's other things I think we can steal back from the industry. Freezing began with preserving fruits and vegetables and fish. What happened? The industry took freezing and gave us TV dinners and that huge treacherous swath of the grocery store called the freezer aisle. Well, today you're finding farmers growing fantastic fruits and vegetables and using high technology freezers to preserve the nutrients, the quality, the texture of those products. One of my favorites is a company in Maine that makes frozen wild-grown blueberries and freeze them. They're inexpensive, they're convenient, right? I'm ticking off all the hallmarks of ultra-processed food, but it's not. And they're incredibly good for us. And they're taking back technology that the companies took from us. And so I think I'll stop there because I see some questions coming in, and I'd love to open this up to you and have sort of more of a conversation. Thank you for listening. Thank you for reading. Thank you for supporting small independent bookstores. It's really terrific. So shall we go to some questions? I think I'm going to open the Q&A. And here's a question from DB. Thank you for the presentation. I read recently that there are crop sprays containing MSG, meaning even fruit veggies are addictive. If this is true, how can we access food not impacted by things like this? Or what would you recommend? So, more and more growers are growing organically, which means that they're using less pesticide, not zero necessarily, but certainly less. And if you're concerned about this sort of incidental contamination of food with that, I think organic is a great way to go, especially if you can afford organic, which tends to be a bit more expensive. It's also much better for the environment, for farm workers. There are other reasons to like that. The one caution about going in the grocery store and seeing the word organic on food is that it can still be on food packages of ultra processed food that are not so great for you nutritionally, because it's just a term reflecting the way the crops are grown with certain or not certain pesticides. So I think that would sort of cover that question. Um, this is from Rose. Unlike alcohol or drugs, we can't really be sober or abstain from food. From your research, what did you find to be helpful approaches for those of us who are addicted to food? Wow, that is one of the ways that food is more problematic than drugs, because you can't go cold turkey like you can with a drug. You can't lock yourself in a room in order to avoid any contact with drugs. We need food. We'd starve. Food is everywhere. The marketing is everywhere. I mean, for people addicted to food, it's like having their drug dealer constantly in their face, trying to sell them drugs that are cheap and legal and there's no risk, quote unquote, to them. It's really, really difficult. I've met people who can't touch a grain of sugar without losing control. And for them, the only way they can deal with that is abstinence. It's avoiding all products with that trigger food, whether it's sugar or something else. And it's just really, really hard for them. Even when they lose weight, I met a man in Ottawa named Don who incredibly lost 180 pounds. He went from 360 to 180 in 13 months through masses of kind of sheer willpower and also great fortune, because he didn't have a family to take care of. He had a good job. He could focus entirely on losing that weight. But the problem, the nightmare, if you will, for him began when he lost that weight, because his entire body was fighting to put that weight back on. And so he found himself needing to put locks on the kitchen cabinets. There were times when he got on an intercity bus in order to avoid any contact at all when he felt he was most vulnerable to backsliding and succumbing to those trigger foods of his. And that's kind of another really important aspect of addiction, whether it's drugs and cigarettes or food, is that it can change over time, and we can be vulnerable at certain times of the day, certain times of our lives, certain circumstances when stress, etc., comes in. The pandemic is kind of a perfect example of that, and it illustrates another point, and another way that food can be more problematic than drugs. When the pandemic hit, some of us thought there was at least one small benefit, which is it may allow us to start changing our eating habits. At least we were getting away from the vending machine, which was one of the most treacherous parts of the processed food industry. Well, what happened is many of us turned our kitchens into vending machines, because when we went shopping, under the stress of the moment, we began buying junk food that we hadn't had since we were kids. And the reason we did this is because one of the most powerful things that the food companies have that they could use against us is the power of memory. We start creating memories for food at a really young age, possibly even in the womb, and we carry those for the rest of our lives. And those memories, when they're strong, can surface, many, many years later, even after we've had that food. And so, lo and behold, food companies' snack sales soared during the pandemic, tapping into, if you will, sort of the power of memories, which they work really hard at controlling. And so one of the things that people who are dealing with kind of severe food addictions, or even just kind of a general loss of control over what we're eating, is realizing that it takes time, right? If you have a lifetime of building up bad eating habits, you can't just change in a week or 2 weeks. It's going to take longer than that, because what you're doing is, with the new habits, you're kind of digging new memory channels in your head. Sorry about the metaphor, but it's which is great because those channels then it's going to make it easier for you and more it'll make you more apt to respond to cues for good food and get excited by things like broccoli. In fact, one of my food scientists said to me, I was pushing him to sort of tell me, you know, what's like most problematic for people, salt, sugar, fat. And he goes, you know, Michael, I actually think that we like what we eat more than we eat what we like, meaning that we can change our liking of food based on our habits and through repetition. And I thought that was a really positive and powerful message. I did not go to high school in Petaluma, came a question. I went to high school in San Francisco, a school called Lowell. Um, Chris wants to know, he says, I like, or she, sorry, I like tortilla chips. Are they bad? The ingredients are just corn, oil, salt. I have to tell you a funny story. So, by the way, and there's more to these corn chips than that. So, things I've been talking about. There's texture, there's smell. We have incredible instinct for smell that the companies know how to use against us, if you will. The but this reminds me, I have a little video on my website, which you could go to as mossbooks.us, where I take some Fritos and light them with a match, and they go up in flame because 50% of their calories is coming from corn oil. And it's sort of just a little way of showing how densely packed the calories are in these products. I actually love Fritos in the sense that in my spare time, I do a little mountain climbing. And when you're mountain climbing, especially in the winter, you have the opposite problem of lots of us, which is you need tons of calories. And so I picked this up from my niece who crunches a bag of Fritos, takes it with her, and like sprinkles it over her backpacking food for because there could be like 1,400 calories in a little bag of Fritos like that. So I thought that was like a really useful trick, and just a fascinating way of kind of showing the caloric density in these products, which is another thing that will kind of seduce us. So are chips bad? I mean, not, if you're eating them occasionally, unless they cause you to lose control or you're eating them so often, or you're not eating them so often, but you're eating things like them so often that much of your diet falls into that category we call ultra processed food, which the last time I checked by one estimate is as much as 3/4 of the calories that we're consuming in North America are coming from highly processed foods. And so I would argue that in some subtle ways, so many of us have lost control of our eating habits to the food giants. Let me go. Help has arrived.
That was so fascinating. And, I'm receiving so many comments. Thank you. People have just loved hearing you talk about this.
Oh,
I want to
good.
ask you a couple things. I know you had a book similar to this, and you probably learned and were surprised by much more the first round, but what surprised you most after writing this?
I think two things. One is that how food in so many ways can be even more addictive than drugs. I mean, that was really kind of shocking and surprising to me. And then also going back to insiders and not eating their own products, how many people, I talk to in the industry who lose control over these products, the products that they make, and they know how problematic these products can be. That to me was, that said, look, they can't like say we didn't know anymore when their own people are experiencing what many of us do.
It's so fascinating, and even with the addiction comparison, I can't imagine how difficult it would be, to have food everywhere, or sugar everywhere around you, at least with alcohol, like the bars and there's an aisle, but with food and sugar, yeah.
Yeah, I mean the first thing in alcohol, so someone who's addicted to alcohol will be told is don't ever go near a bar. And what do we have to do? We have to go into the equivalent of a bar every time we go shopping for groceries. And that's like so difficult for people to deal with.
Yeah. We have a couple more comments and questions. DB is wondering if you feel comfortable sharing your opinion. What do you think about using fasting to reset the palate and food preferences?
Yeah, I'm really kind of agnostic on that. I think by chance I do a little sort of fasting day to day. I mean, I tend to eat a late breakfast. Um, there are different methods. I'm not sure I eat all my food in a day in 8 hours or 10 hours, but I personally kind of like that idea of emptying out the stomach and starting over. But look, things work. The thing about diet, and I don't mean just losing weight, but the thing about approach to food, different things work for different people, and sometimes they're hard to make stick too. And so one of the most brilliant rules of thumb I hear from dieting experts, weight experts, is don't try something that's too strange and too different from what you're used to, or it may be really hard to stick with, and then you may end up in sort of a more difficult situation even before you started, and it's kind of vicious cycle.
Yeah,
So
it's
if it works
interesting.
for you, that's the bottom line. If it works for you, fantastic. Go
Right. There's
for
so many fad diets. And, my sister's keto right now. And I always ask her, like, are you in ketosis? Are you in ketosis? Like, what,
it.
it just seems, I don't know.
But if it works for her,
Yeah.
wow, fantastic.
Yeah, it seems true. We have a comment from an anonymous attendee who says, when I was a university student in the 60s, I was highly influenced by Adele Davis, You Are What You Eat. I have long been perplexed that the concept virtually disappeared in the society. I am fortunate that my addictions are towards cruciferous and other veggies, maybe too many fruits. During COVID, I determined not to buy any packaged snacks food. And even though I tend to overeat nuts, I lost 15 pounds and have kept them off. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, so many people I'm hearing from doctors. It's only anecdotally though, but we've gained weight during the pandemic. Maybe for lack of exercise, but definitely for those snack foods luring us back.
And it's so interesting you made the comment about, memories from childhood and eating. And when the pandemic happens and you need some sort of like comfort, of course you're gonna go
Yeah,
for.
makes total sense.
Yeah, it's terrible. Well, you've made me want to clean out my fridge, so thank you. And I really want to thank you again for being with us tonight. This was absolutely fabulous. And for all of you who were with us tonight, I will be sending an email tomorrow that will have a link to watch this again. It will also include where to buy the book and the 10% discount code. So I would love to have you take us out, Michael.
Um, Thank you for your time. It's a great pleasure. Um, Thanks for your support of independent bookstores. Keep in touch. Don't hesitate to reach out to me. You can find me on my website, mossbooks.us. My email's there. And you can do it. If you're looking to change your eating habits, how you value food, let's keep this conversation going. Tell me what works for you.
Thank you so much. That was such a wonderful way to finish. So thank you all, and I will include his website and all of those details in the email. So until next time, and we'll hope to have you in person soon, Michael.
Excellent. Love to be there.